The radio on my desk clicked on by itself and said my name. I was the only person in the building. All right, welcome back. If you're new here, this is where people send in the stuff that actually happened to them. No scripts, no actors, just real accounts. Today's theme is being alone at work, the graveyard shifts, the empty offices, the buildings that feel completely different once everyone else has gone home. Let's get into the first one. Story 1. The front desk. I worked the overnight front desk at a mid-sized office building for almost a year, mostly checking badges for the handful of people who came in early or left late, and making sure nobody wandered and who wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't a glamorous job by any stretch, but it paid decently for how little was actually required of me most nights. And I'd taken it specifically because it let me study for online classes, while technically being at work, which felt like getting paid twice for the same hours. For most of that year, the job was exactly as boring as it sounds. I'd sit at the desk, do homework for the online classes I was taking, and maybe deal with one or two people the entire night. Usually just an employee grabbing something they'd forgotten, or a cleaning contractor checking. The building had 6 floors, mostly leased out to a few different companies. Nothing unusual about any of them from what I could tell. Standard offices, cubicles, the occasional conference room with glass walls, the kind of generic corporate space you'd find in any mid-sized city. My desk was on the ground floor, right by the main entrance, and I had access to the building's camera system, so I could check different floors if an alarm went off or something looked wrong on a sensor. Though in practice, I almost never needed to use that access for anything beyond the occasional false fire alarm. For most of the year, I never had a reason to actually watch those camera feeds closely. They were just there in case something happened, and mostly nothing ever did, to the point where I sometimes went entire weeks without pulling up a single feed beyond a quick glance at the front entrance camera out of habit. About 8 months into the job, on a Wednesday night, I noticed that the elevator indicator on my desk panel showed movement, the little light tracking the elevator car moving between floors, even though I hadn't called it and hadn't seen anyone come through the front doors that night. I watched it go from the ground floor up to the 4th floor, stop there for almost a full minute, and then come back down. I want to be clear that elevators doing strange things isn't automatically alarming. Buildings have quirks, sensors misfire, and I genuinely never thought much about the elevator before that night, since I'd never had a reason to watch it that closely. I pulled up the camera feed for the 4th floor out of simple curiosity, expecting to see nothing. Maybe a cleaning crew I'd forgotten was scheduled that night. The 4th floor hallway was completely empty. No cleaning crew, no employee working late, nothing. The elevator doors on that floor's camera feed were closed, showing no sign that they'd ever opened at all, despite the indicator on my desk clearly showing the car had stopped there. I told myself it was a sensor glitch, wrote it down in my nightly log, more out of habit than genuine concern, and went back to my homework. About 20 minutes later, the same thing happened again. Elevator moving to the 4th floor, stopping, coming back down, no one visible on any camera the whole time. This became a pattern over the following weeks. Always the 4th floor, always late at night, usually somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. Some nights it wouldn't happen at all, which almost made it worse in a way, since I could never predict when I'd glance at that panel and see the indicator light quietly crawling upward on its own. I mentioned it to my supervisor during a shift handoff, and he just shrugged and said the building was old. Elevators do weird things sometimes. Nothing to worry about, unless it actually got stuck with someone inside, which felt like a reasonable enough answer at the time, even though it didn't fully sit right with me. One night, maybe a month after I'd first noticed the pattern, I decided to actually go up and look at the fourth floor myself, instead of just watching it on a screen. I locked the front desk, which I wasn't strictly supposed to do, but the building was completely empty at that hour anyway, and took the stairs up rather than the elevator, not wanting to be the one causing the exact anomaly I was trying to investigate. The fourth floor was leased to an accounting firm. Rows of cubicles and a few private offices along the far wall. Everything dark, except the emergency exit signs glowing faintly at either end of the hallway, casting just enough green-tinted light to make out the shapes of desks and chairs, without actually illuminating much of anything. I walked the length of it slowly, checking each aisle of cubicles, finding nothing, except the ordinary mess of abandoned coffee cups and sticky notes that offices accumulate, the kind of clutter that looks completely different at 1 a.m. than it would during a normal workday, somehow more abandoned, like the whole floor had been left in a hurry, rather than simply closed up for the night. At the far end, near where the elevator camera was mounted, I noticed one of the private offices had its door slightly ajar, light bleeding out from underneath in a thin line along the carpet. Every other office on that floor was dark. I walked toward it, telling myself someone had probably just left a desk lamp on by accident, a completely mundane thing that happens in offices constantly. I pushed the door open, and the office was empty, desk lamp on like I'd expected, papers neatly stacked, nothing out of place. What stopped me was the computer monitor on the desk, which was also on, displaying a document that had clearly been actively edited, a cursor blinking in the middle of a sentence that trailed off mid-word. I checked the login session on the computer, more out of the kind of automatic curiosity you get when something doesn't add up than any real plan for what to do with the information. The session showed a login timestamp from just over an hour earlier, and the username on the account matched an employee I actually recognized, a woman who worked on that floor, because she was one of the few people who occasionally came through the front desk during my shift for early meetings. I called my supervisor immediately, told him what I'd found, and he told me to just turn off the lamp and the monitor and lock up the office, that people forget to log out all the time. Nothing worth escalating. I did what he said, though something about the unfinished sentence on that screen stuck with me the entire rest of the night, the cursor just sitting there mid-thought like whoever had been typing had simply stopped without warning. The next day, out of curiosity I couldn't quite let go of, I asked around a little, carefully, trying not to sound like I was accusing anyone of anything. It turned out that employee, the one whose login was still active on that computer, had put in her resignation almost 3 weeks before that specific night, and hadn't been back into the office even once since her last day. Her badge access had been deactivated over 2 weeks prior to, when I found that monitor still logged into her account, mid-sentence, in an office that should have had no reason for anyone to be in it at all. I never figured out who was logging into her account, or typing on that document, or riding that elevator up to the 4th floor in the middle of the night, for weeks before I ever noticed the pattern. I quit that job about 2 months later for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this, at least officially. But I'd be lying if I said the fourth floor wasn't part of why I stopped looking forward to those overnight shifts the way I used to. That's the first story. This next one comes from someone who worked in a completely different kind of building, but the same basic fear, being the only person left in a place that's supposed to be empty. Story 2. The warehouse radio. I worked security at a distribution warehouse for a little over 2 years, mostly solo overnight shifts, walking the floor every hour or so, and monitoring the loading dock cameras from a small office near the front entrance. The warehouse was massive, rows of shelving 3 stories high, and during the day it was full of noise and people, forklifts beeping, pallets being moved, the constant background hum of a working facility. But at night, once the last shift of workers cleared out around 11, it was just me for the rest of the night, until the morning crew arrived around 6. 7 straight hours of a building, so quiet you could hear the HVAC system cycling on and off from almost anywhere on the floor. I'd gotten used to the quiet over the first year. If anything, I liked it. There's a particular kind of peace to being the only person in a massive space, responsible for it, walking rows that stretch on for what feels like forever with nothing but the sound of your own footsteps and the occasional settling creak of metal shelving. The warehouse had an old radio on the desk in the security office, one of those handheld units that could pick up whatever the day staff had set it to, usually just a local station playing music quietly in the background while I did my rounds. I never really thought about that radio one way or another. It was just part of the office, something that had been there since before I started, probably older than my job itself. About a year and a half into the job, on an unremarkable Thursday night, I was sitting at the desk doing paperwork around 2 a.m. when the radio, which had been off, since I always turned it off before starting my rounds, and only turned it back on once I was back at the desk, clicked on by itself. I want to be clear, this radio had a physical power switch, not some kind of remote or voice activation, an old mechanical toggle that required actual physical pressure to move. I hadn't touched it in at least 20 minutes. It came on already mid-static, that in-between stations hiss you get when a dial isn't quite tuned to anything, and I remember reaching over to just turn it back off, assuming some kind of electrical short or an issue with the power supply. An old building with old wiring, nothing more sinister than that in my head at the time. Before I could reach the switch, the static shifted, briefly, into something that sounded almost like a voice, garbled and mostly unintelligible, the way a radio sounds when it's caught between 2 stations that are both weak. I paused with my hand near the switch, and for just a moment, clear enough that I couldn't convince myself I'd imagined it, the static resolved into my name, spoken plainly, in a voice I didn't recognize as belonging to anyone I knew. I turned the radio off immediately, sat there for a long moment just staring at it, telling myself it had to be some kind of interference, maybe a nearby trucker's CB radio bleeding into the frequency, a completely plausible explanation for a warehouse situated near a major shipping route, with trucks constantly passing through at all hours. I didn't turn the radio back on for the rest of that shift. I did my rounds a little faster than usual that night, checked in with the front gate more frequently than protocol technically required, and was relieved when the morning crew finally showed up and I could go home. I told myself I'd imagined it, or at worst caught some genuine radio interference that happened to sound like my name through sheer coincidence. the kind of pattern matching your brain does automatically with ambiguous sounds. The same reason people hear voices in white noise or shapes in clouds. I almost fully convinced myself of that explanation by the time my next shift rolled around 3 days later. That next shift, everything was normal until almost the exact same time, a little after 2 a.m. I was on my rounds this time, walking through one of the back aisles on the second level of shelving, when I heard, faintly, coming from the direction of the security office I'd left behind, the radio playing. I hadn't turned it on. I was certain of that, since I made a point that entire week of leaving it explicitly off, even unplugging it entirely from the wall outlet after that first incident, not just switching it off at the toggle. I walked back toward the office at a pace that was faster than I wanted to admit to myself at the time, and as I got closer, I could make out that it wasn't static this time. It was a voice, low, speaking in a cadence that sounded almost like someone reading something aloud, though I couldn't make out actual words until I was almost at the office door. Standing in the doorway, the radio, unplugged, sitting exactly where I'd left it disconnected from the wall, was producing sound, the voice repeating something that took me a moment to parse clearly enough to understand. It was my name again, followed by a string of numbers that I didn't recognize as anything meaningful in the moment, repeated twice, in that same flat, unfamiliar voice. I didn't touch the radio. I backed out of that office, called my supervisor from my cell phone, standing near the loading dock roll-up door, the furthest point in the building from that office I could reasonably justify being at, while still being on the property, and told him what was happening. He told me to just wait outside until he could get there, which took almost 25 minutes. By the time he arrived, the radio had gone silent again, sitting there unplugged, exactly as it had been the whole time. He checked it himself, confirmed it wasn't plugged into anything, no batteries inside that I'd somehow missed, no reasonable mechanism for it to have produced any sound at all. He didn't have an explanation, and to his credit, he didn't try to force one on me either, just said he'd get the radio replaced, and that I should let him know immediately if anything else happened. Out of curiosity, after that shift ended, I looked up the string of numbers I'd heard repeated that second night, the ones that hadn't meant anything to me in the moment, spending a good chunk of my next few days off digging through old company records I technically didn't have great reason to be looking at. It took some searching, but I eventually matched it to an old employee badge number format the company had used years before switching to their current system, a numbering scheme that had been retired long before I'd ever started working there, back when the warehouse operated under different ownership entirely. I never found out whose badge number it might have been, or why it would have come through an unplugged radio at 2 in the morning, twice, calling out my name first, both times before it ever said anything else. I finished out my contract at that warehouse, but declined to renew it when the option came up a few months later, and I've never taken another job that required me to be completely alone overnight in a large building since, even though the pay for that kind of work is genuinely hard to turn down, and I still sometimes catch myself, in other quiet moments, half listening for static that isn't there. And that's it for today. If either of these hit a little too close to home, especially if you've ever worked a solo overnight shift yourself, you're not alone, trust me. The comment section usually has a few people who have had something similar happen. If you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. And if something like this has ever happened to you while working alone, Send it my way. You might hear your own story on here next.